Hi everyone, this is Marinka Lamoureux, and this little video is going to explain how to interpret main effects. So this is an example of what a results section looks like, and I know that many of you just skip right over this because it's really intimidating. There's a lot of numbers, you don't really know what it means, and you just go to the discussion section and see what they say in the discussion section. But after watching this video, we will walk through all of these sentences in this paragraph, at least the ones dealing with main effects, and you'll understand them and you'll realize they're really not that bad and they're not that scary. So first thing, though, I'm going to show a short video that I think is very relaxing and also inspirational. So I think, that the ocean is very peaceful and soothing, and maybe that will make you feel a little bit more relaxed while you're thinking about main effects. But also think about the fact that, great whites are considered these really atrocious and terrifying creatures, and yet this woman was able to swim with them, and it was a really good experience for her. And so perhaps, even though you might think about main effects and interactions as these ferocious and terrifying creatures, you may actually be able to interpret result sections and have a good experience. So let's go ahead and start that good experience. We're going to be looking at Ferdinand Bradley, 1997. If you want to get the article and follow along, you can go to D2L and see the permalink for it and print it out. So what these guys were interested in doing was looking at how much music distracted you or helped you when you were studying had to do with whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert. And they had some really interesting theories about why being introvert or extrovert might matter, and I'm not going to get into that because that's not what this video is about. But if you're kind of curious, I encourage you to go look at the article, and it's kind of cool. Okay, so what they did is they had 10 introverts and extroverts, and all 20 participants completed 2 memory tasks, and the experimenters randomly assigned the participants to either listen to distracting music while they were completing those 2 memory tasks or not listen to distracting music. So after they would do read this 400-word passage, and then they had to answer 6 multiple-choice questions. The participants answered 6 multiple-choice questions, and that was one of the 2 memory tasks. And the other memory task was that participants looked at pictures of 20 objects. And immediately following that, they had to name as many objects as possible. And then there was another version of that, which was that 6 minutes later, after performing a distractor task, they had to try again to name as many objects as possible. So here's a breakdown of the independent variables and dependent variables. So you can see there's 2 independent variables, whether or not somebody is an introvert or an extrovert, and whether the music was on or off. And then they have 3 dependent variables for each participant. They have their performance on the reading comprehension test, and then they have the performance on immediate object recall, and then after distractor task, 6 minutes later. So there's 2 independent variables and 3 dependent variables. Okay, so what is a main effect? A main effect is answering the question of whether the level of the independent variable of interest matters without considering the level of the other independent variables. And I know that kind of sounds like gobbledygook, and I'll continue explaining. So one of the things that a main effect allows you to do is imagine that you had only run the study with a single independent variable. What would the effect on the dependent variable have been? So when you have main effects, experimenters can have studies that use multiple independent variables, but then they can run analyses that tell them, well, what if we had only done one of these independent variables? What would have happened? So instead of having, if you have 3 independent variables, instead of having to run 3 different studies, you can put all 3 independent variables in one study, but then use a main effect to see what would have happened if you had only used the one independent variable in your study. So what does that look like for this article that we're talking about? Well, the first main effect would be, does whether the music was on or off influence memory without considering whether someone was an introvert or extrovert? So if the experimenters had not looked at whether people were introverts or extroverts and had only tested them when the music was on versus the music was off, what would the results have been? And the other main effect is, does whether someone was an introvert or an extrovert influence memory without considering whether the music was on or off? So if the experimenters had not manipulated the music being on or off, and they had only tested people for whether they were introverts or extroverts and then tested their memory, what would the outcome have been? So these main effects are a really handy way for us to find out what's going on with our independent variables, pretending that our other independent variables weren't a part of the study. Okay, so here is the text from the article on the main effects, looking at the immediate memory recall. So when the participants looked at the 20 objects and then had to immediately name them. So here's the text and the table, and we're going to walk through fairly slowly how to look at all this to understand what you need to understand about the main effects. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at the main effect of music on immediate object recall. So what is the thing that we're trying to answer? If we're looking at the main effect of music, you're trying to say, does whether or not the music was on influence immediate object recall without considering whether someone was an introvert or extrovert? So that's what that ANOVA, that main effect from that ANOVA, will tell you. And we can look, and it says a main effect of whether the music was, there was a main effect of whether the music was on or off. So there was a main effect. So we know the answer to this question. Whether or not the music was on does influence immediate object recall. But we don't know the direction of the effect. We don't know, the ANOVA itself does not tell us whether or not when the music was on or off they had better recall. What you have to do is you have to go and look at the table and see the actual means. So here are the means for when the music was on for introverts and extroverts for the short-term memory task. And you can sort of, in your brain, what you're doing is you're disregarding whether or not they were introverts or extroverts. So what you're going to do is in your brain, you're going to average these two numbers. So it's about 15. And then you're going to do the same thing for the other level of this independent variable. So when the music is off, so you're going to average across these two numbers, and I'm going to say it's about 14. So this doesn't have to be very precise. If you were actually writing up and reporting it, you would need to actually calculate the means and standard deviations, but when you're just trying to interpret it, you can say, okay, when the music was on, the mean is higher for memory recall, for the short-term memory recall task, than when the music was off. So now I can interpret this main effect. And I can say that people had a more immediate recall when the music was on than when it was off, without considering whether they were an introvert or extrovert. And that last part is important because you're, again, making sure that it's clear to yourself and to whoever's reading your sentence that you're saying that this is not taking into consideration introversion or extroversion. It's just imagining that whether the music was on or off was the independent variable. So again, we decided that we were going to look for a main effect of music. We wrote out the question that we'd be answering. Then we looked at the ANOVA and saw that it was significant for the main effect of music. So we can say, yes, there's an effect. And then you go and look at the actual means of the dependent variable for the different levels to know the direction of the effect, to know that there was more immediate recall when the music was on than when it was off. Okay, so we've done the main effect of music. Now we're going to do the main effect of introversion or extroversion. And so what does that question look like? It says, does whether someone was an introvert or extrovert influence immediate object recall without considering whether the music was on or off? And if you go look up at the highlighted section, you can see that it says there is no main effect of introversion or extroversion. So it's the answer to that question is no. So when you interpret that main effect, then what you say is, whether someone was an introvert or extrovert did not influence immediate recall without considering whether the music was on or off. So if they had only done a study where they had looked at personality type and they hadn't manipulated whether the music was on or off, you can say that it's likely that they would not have found an effect of personality type on memory recall. So when you look at these main effects, what these two main effects are basically telling you in sort of a big picture is that for immediate object recall, when the music was on, people had more recall than when it was off. So if you're going to be trying to remember objects, then it's probably something that you might want to consider to listen to music while you're trying to remember objects. And that there's really no difference between introverts and extroverts in terms of how well they immediately recall objects when you're not considering whether or not introverts and extroverts are listening to music while they're trying to learn those memory objects. So that's what main effects are. And they're really simple to read out of the text and off of the tables. You just can't get drowned in the amount of sentences and the amount of numbers. Just figure out which main effects you're looking for, go into the text and find the sentences where they talk about those specific main effects, find the ANOVA, find whether or not it's significant, and then look at the table. So it's really not that hard. But we're going to do a bunch more to make sure that you get comfortable with it. So now this is the text for looking at the delayed recall of the pictures. So they had the pictures, then they did this distractor task for 6 minutes, and then they tried to recall, name all of the objects they looked at. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at a main effect of music on delayed object recall. So the way that sentence looks is, does whether or not the music was on influence delayed object recall without considering whether someone was an introvert or extrovert? So we go up and we find in the text where they're talking about the main effect of music, and they're saying there was no main effect of the music being on or off. So we know the answers to that question. So we can say that whether or not the music was on did not influence delayed object recall without considering whether someone was an introvert or extrovert. We can look at this main effect of personality, and the question is, does whether someone was an introvert or extrovert influence delayed object recall without considering whether the music was on or off? And we can look at what's highlighted, and it says there was no main effect of introversion extroversion, so we know the answer to that question is no. And the interpretation would be whether someone was an introvert or extrovert did not influence delayed object recall without considering whether the music was on or off. So what you could say is If all you knew about somebody was whether or not they were an introvert or an extrovert, you would not be able to predict whether they would if all you knew was whether somebody was an introvert or an extrovert, you would predict that introverts would perform equally as well on this delayed object recall task. And that's the main effect of personality. And if you're thinking about the main effect of music, you would say if all you knew was whether the music was on or off, you would expect that people would perform the same on delayed object recall if the music was on or if it was off. So that's how you interpret those two main effects. So let's do another one. And this next one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the text and the table up on the screen, and I want you to pause the video and try and figure out how to fill in these tables on your own. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and I'll walk you through it. Okay, so for the main effect of music, we're looking to see, does whether or not the music was on influence reading comprehension without considering whether someone was an introvert or extrovert? So this is, this is not the object recall task anymore, it's the reading comprehension task. So we look up at the text and it says, no, there was no main effect of music. So we can interpret that to mean that whether or not the music was on did not influence reading comprehension without considering whether someone was an introvert or extrovert. And let's do the main effect of personality. So here's the question we're asking, and we're going to look at the text, and we can see it says there was no main effect of this. And that's our interpretation. So what this means is if all you knew for the main effect of music, if all you knew was whether or not the music was on or off, you would expect that people would perform equally as well whether the music was on or off on this reading comprehension task. And for the main effect of personality, if all you knew was whether someone was an introvert or an extrovert, you would expect that people would perform equally well on this reading comprehension task. So we've walked through that entire paragraph that I first put up on the screen that I imagine you guys really panicked when you saw. And you can see it wasn't that hard. Again, you're just looking, just go through in a careful and deliberate way, look in the text, see what the effect is, and then look at if it's significant, look at the table and figure out the means and the direction of the effect, and then say what the direction of the effect is in your interpretation sentence. As long as you're systematic about it, you really shouldn't have any problems. And we're going to go through one other article to give you a little bit more practice. So in this study, Leach and Ansel were interested in how being in survival conditions influences people's thinking abilities. And so what they had was they had participants who were undergoing a field survival exercise, and they completed 5 tasks assessing their thinking abilities. And they completed these tasks at 3 time points. They did one before the course began, so they did a pre-test. They did one session 12 to 24 hours into the course, and then a last session between 72 and 96 hours in the course. So these 5 tasks these participants completed these 5 tasks at 3 different times. And those participants' scores were compared to a control group. So they took the tasks at the same 3 times. They were just in a classroom. So they weren't undergoing this sort of field survival exercise. And they weren't out in the elements. They weren't, being sleep deprived, all that kind of stuff. They were just in a regular classroom taking these tasks. And if you're kind of interested in exactly what these field survival exercises were like, I encourage you to go through this article and look in detail. But again, that's not what we're talking about in this video. So I won't go through and talk about all 5 dependent variables, but I've picked out 2. So one dependent variable that we'll talk about is a map search. So they gave participants 2 minutes to find things on a map. And the second dependent variable is this lottery test. And essentially, participants had to listen to strings of letters and numbers and identify when specific things were said in this tape and write those things down. So both of these tasks are requiring them to pay attention to what they're given and to kind of specifically be looking for certain things and note when they see those things. Okay, so they have two independent variables: whether or not the participants were undergoing this field survival experience, and time. So was it the pretest or was it the session that was 12 to 24 hours later, or the session that was 36 to 72 hours later? And there were two dependent variables that we'll be talking about. There was the map search and the lottery test. So I'm going to put this up, and I would like you to try and interpret the main effect of session and the main effect of map search. And when you're ready, unpause the video and I'll talk you through it. So for the main effect of session, the question we're asking is, does the day of administration influence map searchability without considering whether people were actually in a survival situation? So essentially, if all they had done was had people complete these tasks, is there an effect of just kind of repetitively doing them over 3 different sessions? And you can look up at where it's highlighted and you can see there is indeed a significant effect of session. So yes, there's a significant main effect. And now let's interpret this. So we're looking at the 2-minute map search. So we're going to average across the experimental and control groups in our brains for session 1, 2, and 3. Because we're just interested in does what session it is influence performance on the map search. So if you sort of briefly look across those 3, you can see that participants' scores improved as time went on. And so we can interpret that to say that map search scores increased the more times people completed the map search without considering whether they were in a survival situation. And now let's go ahead and look at the main effective group on map search. So we're interested in whether someone was in a survival situation influenced how well they could search for these things on the map, not considering what day they were taking the test. And if you see in the highlighted part of the text, you can see there was no significant main effective group on map search. So you can say that whether someone was in a survival situation did not influence map searchability without considering the day of administration. So the big picture way to think about this would be to say that the main effect of session tells you that with practice, people got better at doing this task if you're not considering whether or not they were in a survival situation, whether or not they were actually on the elements. And for the main effective group on map search, you can say that whether or not people were in the elements did not influence how well they performed on this map search task if you're not considering the day of administration. And now we're going to do this again for the lottery test dependent variable. Go ahead and pause the video and try and figure this out, and when you're ready, I'll talk you through it. So for the main effective session, we're looking at whether the day of administration influences lottery testability when you're not considering whether people are actually in a survival situation. And if you look up at what's highlighted, you can see there was a significant effective session. So their answer to, is there a main effective session, is yes. And we're going to try and interpret that. So if you look at the lottery scores, if you sort of, in your head, average those things, you can see that people's performance is actually getting worse as session increases. So you might say, well, maybe they're getting tired of this task and they don't feel like doing it anymore. But that's not for us to interpret at the moment. All we're doing is saying what the actual statistical effect is. So you would say lottery test scores decreased the more times people completed the lottery test without considering whether they were in a survival situation. Now we'll look at the main effect of group on lottery tests, and we'll look at whether or not someone was in a survival situation influences lottery test ability without considering the day of administration. And you look up and see what's highlighted, and you can see that there's no main effect of group on lottery test. And so we can say that whether someone was in a survival situation had no influence on performance on this lottery test when you're not considering the day of administration. So the big picture would be to say that people who complete this lottery test over time are getting worse when you don't consider whether or not they're in a survival situation. And for the main effect of group on lottery tests, whether or not they were in a survival situation did not influence lottery test ability without considering the day of administration. And that is how you find and interpret main effects.